You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to Filmmaking Conversations with Damian Swaby. Listen to conversations with award-winning filmmakers, directors from the golden age of television, and creatives from the indie film community who continue to inspire the next generation of filmmakers. And now, over to your host, Damian Swaby.
Welcome to the latest episode of Filmmaking Conversations with me, Damian Swaby. Today we're focusing on the cornerstone resource for independent filmmakers and legal professionals alike. A comprehensive book that serves as a guiding light through the often murky waters of federal and state securities regulations. This episode is especially valuable for those of you who are navigating the challenging terrain of raising private investment for film projects. We'll explore insights from a seasoned securities and entertainment attorney who has dedicated over 3 decades to advising independent filmmakers. His expertise is crystallized in this book, which breaks down the complexities of securities law compliance, aiming to shield filmmakers from the pitfalls of criminal and civil liability while securing the funds necessary to realize their projects. As we unpack the contents of this book, we will understand the critical reasons behind the application of securities laws to most investor financing transactions. The book outlines the decisions filmmakers must make, the information that must be disclosed to potential investors, and how to adhere to SEC policies regarding financial projections. Moreover, our discussion will touch upon choosing the right investment vehicle for various forms of investor financing and the constraints on employing finders. This book is not only an indispensable manual for film students and independent producers, but also a vital tool for attorneys and instructors in the realm of entertainment and securities law. In his consulting practice, Mr. Combs offers tailored advice on the most suitable finance method for a given project. He helps clients understand the nuances between securities and non-securities offerings, guiding them through the decision-making process that determines whether investors will be passive or active participants in a film venture. I started the podcast by asking him how he got started in the industry, and stay tuned as we dive deep into his book, Investor Financing of Independent Film. And for the link to buy this book, check out the show notes for all the information you need and a whole lot more.
I started off as a news reporter in radio and television in Austin, Texas, and then I went to Houston and was practicing law, doing securities work, and then the law changed. Congress, in its wisdom, passed the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and that took away most of the offerings that we were doing at that time. But that's when I learned that some independent film producers do raise money to produce their films with investors, and usually that involves the sale of security. And so I was basically a securities attorney. So I went to Los Angeles specifically for the purpose of working with low-budget independent film producers and trying to help them comply with federal state securities laws when they raise money from investors. And that's what I've been doing for 30 plus years. And I've done a lot of research about the industry and about film finance and written several books, one of which is what prompted our interview today.
In chapter 1 of your book, could you share some stories that illustrate your approach to choosing finance methods, the legal aspects of investor financing, and any advice you have for independent producers seeking investor funds?
The chapter in the book where you're talking about true Hollywood stories.
Yes, sorry.
There are a lot of stories. I only included 3 in the book, and I'll mention 2 to you real quickly. One was good news, the other was bad news. So I'm being fair. But some years ago, a young man came into my office in Los Angeles, and he had recently graduated from UCLA Film School, and he wanted to raise about $120,000 just to do a really ultra low budget independent film. He wrote the script, he was going to direct, he was going to produce. And so I put together the offering for him, and I'm not involved on the creative side at all. And but I put the offering together for him, and he went out and successfully raised. I think he eventually got to $150,000, although some of that may have come from credit card. But he also got the film. He produced the film, had no recognizable names, little ensemble cast, and he got it into Sundance, which is a victory in and of itself. And didn't win any awards or anything, but he did get $1 million advance from a distributor for a theatrical release for this little film. And he then went on. So he and his investors were in profit before the film was even released. And so he did exactly what I hope all of my clients would be able to do, but that doesn't happen that often. But from there, Buena Vista hired him to direct Annapolis, and then he went on to direct several of the Fast and Furious franchise and Space Jam and Star Trek. And by now, you probably know who I'm talking about. It's Justin Lin. And he's a well-known director in Hollywood, and he got his start with a little film investor offering that we did some years ago. And so that's a good news story. The bad news story, I had another client early on that wanted to do what we call a development offering, where you're raising money for the development of a project, not the production. And so he did that. I put together the offering for him. He went out and raised the money. And he acquired the rights to a book, for the underlying story, hired a screenwriter to write the script, which suggests that anybody can be a producer. You just have to put these elements together. So he got the underlying rights to the story, hired a screenwriter to write the script. He attached one element, an actress. Her name was Donna Douglas, who you may remember from TV as Ellie Mae in the Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, okay.
And that was his partner. And he was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so they went and pitched this project. They basically had a little producer's package. And so they went and pitched the project to several of the companies there in Los Angeles. And one of them, it was Bette Midler's All Girls Production, said their producer said, well, we like what you're doing here, and but we don't want to produce with you because neither of you have producing experience, which is not a uncommon thing in Hollywood, or an approach that they might take. And so my clients walked away from the deal. They didn't want to just sell their rights and their story. A couple of years later, I saw a project, a film coming out that looked very familiar. And so I called my former client and said, hey, you ought to check this out. He did. He hired an expert who did an analysis, came up with about 150 similarities. And they filed a copyright infringement lawsuit in New York, which subsequently was changed to Los Angeles, a federal lawsuit. And ultimately, the court decided that there were about 12 elements of a copyright infringement law infraction, and that my former client had met 11 of the 12, but the 12th was what's called tone, whatever that is, and the judge, in other words, the judge said that the tone of this film is slightly different than yours, therefore you can't, win in court. And he gave some very restrictive instructions to the jury, which came back, and voted for the defendants, which at that time was, I think, All Girl Productions. Maybe even Disney was involved. And I say in the book, to this day, I'm convinced that there was something going on in the background there between the judge and the LA-based companies or something, because even the jurors came out and said, hey, we know that these people stole your ideas. And what they did is they hired 4 or 5 different writers over a period of a year or so and rewrote the thing several times and trying to make it different. But it came out to be the same thing. The name of that film is Sister Act. And, so I'm very wary of this pitching thing that goes on in the film industry. You see all these things. So, well, come pitch to these executives and pitch to these. You got to be really careful. You got to get at least a treatment. They had a script, and you've got to register it with the Copyright Office. Even that won't protect you. It didn't in this situation. But it's the best you can do. And of course, you need to have witnesses, and you need to take pictures, and you need to confirm access for these producers and all of that. But that was a bad experience. So that's kind of the chapter on Hollywood stories.
That is a bad experience. I mean, every Christmas we kind of watch Sister Act. It's never going to be the same again now. That's a big shame.
Yeah.
And in chapter 2, you discuss securities law enforcement in detail. Can you share how this impacts film finance and what filmmakers need to be aware of when seeking investments in their projects?
Well, our whole conversation today will be about things that filmmakers need to be aware of. But basically, in that chapter, and in fact, it was the publisher's idea to put it up front. I had it in the back, and they said, "Hey, put this up front because it helps humanize the whole process." And basically, what I was doing there is saying, "Look, filmmakers don't." Often, I mean, it's not really common for filmmakers to get involved in an enforcement action or get involved in litigation with respect to a securities offering, but it does happen. And in fact, I knew 3 individuals there in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles that were running a telemarketing operation and raising money to make a film. And they got somebody, I think, in Alabama complained to the Alabama Enforcement Agency there, and then ultimately the SEC got involved, and these guys ended up all being convicted of securities fraud. 2 of them went to prison. The third one didn't go to prison because he died before he was supposed to go to prison. But it does happen, and that's what I'm talking about in this chapter. And then I go on to cite some other similar examples of enforcement actions against filmmakers in Texas and California, maybe one in New York, and that's it. And so all I'm saying there is that it's not common, but it does happen. So you have to know what you're doing and be careful.
Oh gosh, jail. Yes, that doesn't sound like a fun place to be. So
No.
Yeah, you definitely got to be careful. And in chapter 3, you provide an overview of film finance. Could you elaborate on the different models of film financing that are currently in vogue and how they offer different terms of risk and reward?
Yeah, I don't worry about what's in vogue so much because, what's popular is not necessarily what's good for your film. I wrote a book called 43 Ways to Finance Your Feature Film, this one, and it's in its 3rd edition. And basically the approach I took with that book was I listed, 43 different ways to finance your feature film. And discussed it, and then had pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. So what I learned by studying film finance is that there are a lot of different ways to finance a feature film. All forms of film finance have advantages and disadvantages. And I always got the question when I did lecturing out in Los Angeles from independent producers, what's the best way to finance a feature film? Well, there are a lot of different ways to do it. And producers need to be, part of what they need to do is become somewhat familiar with the advantages and disadvantages of each form of film finance. And I then analyzed the film finance situation and realized that there were 5 different film finance / distribution scenarios or tracks that you typically see in the industry, and that's from the in-house production distribution situation. I'll open the page here to the book to the chart. In-house production, you've got production financing distribution deal, and then the negative pickup deal, and then the acquisition agreement. In other words, a distributor just acquires a film that has been produced by somebody else, and then a rental distributor deal. So those are the 5 typical scenarios that you see and have traditionally seen. Netflix and the streamers come in, and they do pretty much the same thing as the studios do. They do the in-house production and maybe the production financing distribution deal. But in those situations, what we see is that there are 3 phases in the life of a film that can be financed separately. So let me say that again. There are 3 phases in the life of a film that can be financed separately. And that's development, production, including pre-production and post-production, and distribution. And these 5 scenarios, you'll see a different combination in terms of who's financing which phase. So like in in-house production, that all 3 phases are going to be paid for by the studio. That's development, production, and distribution, and the affiliated distributor. In the production financing distribution deal, the independent producer develops the project and pitches it to the studio, And the studio then says, okay, we'll loan you the money to produce the film and we'll also distribute. So the first phase was paid for by the producer or his or her investors. Second phase and the third phase, production distribution by the distributor. Then the negative pickup deal, again, the independent producer puts together a package and goes to not to the creative executive at the studio or at the streamer, but instead goes to an executive at the distributor. And you're looking for a distribution deal, which then you take to a bank and get a loan based on using the distribution deal somewhat in effect as collateral. And in that situation, again, the first phase, the development is paid for by the producer and or his or her investors. And the second phase is based on a loan from the bank. And then the distributor pays the distribution expenses and then recoups them. In an acquisition situation, acquisition agreement, the distributor is simply acquiring the rights to a film that's already produced. First two phases, development and production, were financed by the producer and or his or her investors. And in a rent-a-distributor deal, all three phases are paid for by the producer. You're giving money to the distributor and relying on their expertise to distribute the film. So those are really, that's kind of an overview of film finance.
So pre-offering considerations is a crucial part of your book. Can you give us some insights on what these considerations are and why they are important in the context of film finance?
I think I touched on a couple of issues there. And one was how important it is to register your treatment and our script with the Copyright Office as opposed to the Writers Guild. In my opinion, the Writers Guild is a waste of money. And it's duplicative of the what you get with the Copyright Office, but you don't really get that much benefit registering with the Writers Guild. You get benefits from registering with the Copyright Office, and I go through and list all of those benefits. The other, let's see what the other was, if I can find that book. Oh, the other was chain of title. I haven't read the book lately. The other issue is chain of title. You can't get your film distributed unless you have a clean chain of title. And that's one of the questions the distributor is going to ask you. You go to them and say, well, we've got this wonderful film. And they're going to say, do you have a clean chain of title? Or let's see your chain of title. And so filmmakers need to be aware of what that is, because it's something that you develop all along the way. It's a series of documents that show who owns the rights to this story and this script and this film. And without any gaps, that would be a clean chain of title. So somebody in the production office has got to be responsible for collecting all of these documents that are created and producing a film. Financing and producing, distributing film is rather document intensive. I know that because I've got 115 sample film industry agreements on my website at filmfinanceattorney.com, and most of them are used in films. So you want to make sure that you take care of the clean chain of title, maintain it. It's basically going to end up being in a banker's box or a portfolio or something with a series of documents all relating to the rights to do this film. And there are no gaps in the ownership. And that's what the distributor is looking for.
Wow.
In effect, see, if you go to a distributor's trying to fill that last distribution slot for the year, and they've got a couple of films they're looking at. One of them, and they're both about the same in terms of the quality of the film. One of them's got a clean chain of title, the other one doesn't. Which one goes? Which one gets distributed? One with a clean chain of title. So take care of that little element. Be aware of what it is. Read about it in the book if you want to. But and I list a lot of the documents that are supposed to be that might end up being in a chain of title.
And in chapter 5, you talk about fitting investor finance into a film finance plan. Sorry. Could you shed light on how to balance investor expectations with the financial realities of film production? Okay,
so of course, with the realities, one of the things we have to do, and if we're doing a securities offering, which we'll talk about in a minute, is to include the risk factors, so that the investors know that it's a risky investment. You certainly don't want to go out and tell people, oh, we're guaranteed to make this film and it's going to be a good film. It's going to be great at the box office. I'm I keep distracting myself and getting off to the other thing, but the chapters about the film plan, what I talk about in there are different situations where investor financing can be useful. It can be useful in development financing, production financing, distribution financing, which we've already talked about, but it can be useful in developing or producing one film or multiple films. And so there are a number of different scenarios that you might undertake with respect to investor financing. So basically that's what that chapter is about.
You mentioned the importance of having a business plan or securities disclosure document in Chapter 6. How does this document play a role in attracting potential investors?
Well, this is a really important part of the book because what I've discovered in my analysis of film finance is that there are three forms of documentation with which to approach film financiers. One is the producer's package. Second is a business plan. Third is a securities disclosure document. Now, part of the job of the independent producer is to know when they need to use each of those documents. Okay, so let's look at the producer's package. When do you use the producer's package? Well, if you're going to a studio executive and trying to get a pitch a project for an in-house production deal, which they're going to acquire the rights and they're going to develop it and produce it, you don't need a business plan for that. That's really important to understand because business plans have been oversold and over-promoted to filmmakers generally. And that's been going on for years. So you don't need a business plan if you're going to pitch to a studio. If you're putting together a producer's package and you're going to try to get a production financing distribution agreement, you don't need a business plan. Industry people don't need to see a business plan. That's embarrassing. They know about the industry. Okay. The third that we talked about earlier of the 5 scenarios, the negative pickup, again, you don't need a business plan because you're going to a distributor. That's an industry insider who already knows the industry. They don't need a business plan. They need a producer's package. They need a script. They need a budget. They need the evidence of attachments and a clean chain of title. That's the basics of a producer's plan. Then, all right, so when do you use a business plan? Or that's the basic of a producer's package. When do you use a business plan as opposed to a securities disclosure document? Both are used with investor financing. Okay. Business plan can only legitimately be used when you're raising money from 2 or 3 active investors. And I'll come back and define that. Whenever you're raising money from a larger group of passive investors, people not involved in management making decisions, you're selling a security, whether you know it or not, whatever you call it. Okay. So then we need to talk about complying with securities laws. Now, active investors are people who are regularly involved or in helping make important decisions with respect to the project. Now, that may not be desirable for a creative venture like film, but it sounds attractive to to producers to go out and find 1 or 2 or 3 active investors. But the problem is they're just pretty rare. To find active investors. We're not talking about people in the film industry, but we're talking about people who have sufficient knowledge and experience in the film industry to help make or play a meaningful role in the decision making. Okay. You must also have a written agreement with them authorizing them to participate in the decision making. And third, they must actually participate in the decision making, and you need to create a paper trail. So this whole idea of raising money with a business plan for a few active investors is really kind of a myth. It can happen, and it may work out. People who put a lot of money in a film tend to throw their weight around, so you have to be careful of that. Most of my clients come in and say, hey, I know I'm selling security. I know I'm raising money from passive investors. That's what I want to do. And so help me comply with federal and state securities laws, and that's what I do.
Excellent. And can you break down the 3 forms of documentation for film finances discussed in Chapter 7 and their relevance in the process of film financing?
When do you use a producer's package? When do you use a business plan? When do you use a securities disclosure document?
In Chapter 8, you explain the contingent promising notes as a film finance method. How do these functions and what sets them apart from each other in the methods of film financing?
Well, the whole idea with that chapter is that some years ago, I had a prospective client come in and they wanted to do they wanted to raise money through contingent promissory notes. That is a loan from some individual or group of individuals that is to be paid back out of the proceeds or the profits of the film. It's contingent upon the film making money. Now, they thought, mistakenly, that because it was a loan as opposed to equity, so to speak, that it wasn't a security. So I did the research on that, published an article in Los Angeles Lawyer magazine talking about it, which is then reprinted here. It's excerpted with permission from the magazine. But in the vast majority, I mean, we're talking 99% of the cases, contingent promissory notes are securities. And so you still have to comply with securities laws. So that was just all I'm doing there is saying, look, don't get the idea that just because it's a loan, it's not a security. If it's a commercial loan, where you're using somebody's money to just buy commercial products that are being sold at retail and so forth, short-term loans, that might turn out to be a non-security. But for film finance, which is more of a long-term financial transaction, contingent promissory note is going to be a security. You still have the obligations to comply with securities laws, just like you would if you were doing limited partnership interest or corporate stock or LLC units.
Could you elaborate on the SEC's Regulation D, Rule 506B exception, and Rule 506C exception covered in Chapter 9 and 10, respectively, and their implications on filmmakers seeking investment?
Yeah, there's a general rule in securities. And keep in mind, again, we're talking about securities because we're talking about raising money from passive investors. And that's based on a Supreme Court case called SEC v. Howey, Howey, which basically says, look, if somebody gives money to somebody else and hopes to make a profit off, has an expectation of making a profit primarily off the effort of that producer or promoter, then that's a security. That's an investment contract. That's one form of security. There are a lot of different forms of security, but that's an investment contract. And so what I've done is sort of summarize that four elements with two words. And those two words are passive investor. After all, what does a passive investor do? They give money to somebody else, hope to make a profit primarily off the effort and expertise of the producer, in this case, in the film industry. And so that is the general rule. Once you realize you're selling security, the general rule is you must register that security with the SEC at the federal level and state securities regulatory authorities in each state where you're going to raise money. That's the general rule. Hardly anybody does that. There have only been about three public offers. That's a public offering, registered offering. Only about three independent films have tried that in the last 20, 25 years, and none of them succeeded. Most independent producers do the exception to the general rule. They rely on exemptions from the registration requirement. Reg D Rule 506B and 506C are two of the exemptions that are available that the SEC has provided. Reg D Rule 506B is the traditional form of securities exemption, and it allows you to raise an unlimited amount of money from up to 35 non-accredited, non-wealthy investors, unlimited accredited, but you have to have a pre-existing relationship. You and others in your group have to have a pre-existing relationship with these prospective investors. You must have known them before the start of the offering. And then 506B allows you to raise money from an unlimited number of accredited investors only. Accredited investors are people with a net worth of $1 million exclusive of their primary residence or net annual income of $200,000, $300,000 with spouse. So you can raise unlimited money, and you don't have to know them in advance. So that's where Slated comes in, for example. Filmmakers post their projects on Slated, and they have a bunch of supposedly Reg D Rule 506B or accredited investors, 506C, accredited investor type accredited investors. And but you can advertise, you can raise money from strangers. You just have to take some extra steps to confirm the accredited investor status of those investors. And so it's important when filmmakers set out to decide what route they're going to take, that they be aware that there are some choices that need to be made. They need to decide whether they're going to do a Reg D Rule 506B offering to people they know, or they're going to do a Reg D 506C offering to strangers, and take the extra step to confirm their status. And it also, there's some issues that we can talk about disclosure later, but that's also impacted.
So in Chapter 11, you delve into the federal equity crowdfunding law. How has this law changed the landscape of film financing, and what opportunities does it present for independent filmmakers?
Well, I hate to disappoint you there, but in my experience, the federal equity crowdfunding law has not been that useful because the SEC, in my opinion, went too far and required too many notice filings. They want you to file a Form C associated with this regulation. They call it regulation crowdfunding. It's the federal equity crowdfunding law. And the securities are involved. This is not like donation crowdfunding. So whenever we talk about crowdfunding, we always make a distinction between donation crowdfunding or equity crowdfunding or investor crowdfunding. So here we're talking about investor crowdfunding. We're selling a security. Securities laws apply. This is a third exemption that the SEC has provided that you could use to avoid registration. But like I say, they require so many filings before, during, and after the offering that, in my opinion, it's more trouble than it's worth. And I've yet to have a client come in and say, "Well, I want to do it this way." I've had a few inquire, but as soon as I explain to them, about that, about the filings that are required, and knowing that Reg D Rule 506B and 506D are still available, it's a lot easier just to do a Reg D 506B or 506C offering.
And lastly, in Chapter 16, you discuss investor tax incentives. What role do these incentives play in attracting investment for independent films? And how can independent filmmakers use them efficiently?
Tax incentives, one of the points I make in the book is that we need to be careful about the tax incentives. Yes, there's a Section 181 that's still available through 2025, and a new Section 168, both of which allow investors to deduct 100% of their investment. But I think what's happened over the years is that the deduction has changed from the year in which the investment was made to the year in which the production expense was incurred to the year in which the completed film was placed in commerce. Okay, so that's like a year or two later. So it's not as valuable as it used to be, but it's still, it still might be part of the incentive for an investor to invest in a film project, knowing that they might be able to get a deduction based on their cost or their investment. I try to be very careful in the disclosure documents that I prepare to not go too far and not be overly promoting, so to speak, with respect to the tax incentives. But they are there. The law exists. It's available in my PPMs, which is the private placement offering memorandum associated with these Reg D type offerings. I'll have a paragraph or so just pointing out that these tax incentives exist, but they should see their own account. Don't rely on me, mere securities attorney, to explain that to them. And I don't want them relying on my advice with respect to tax matters, because that's a whole new field. There are federal, so those are the federal tax incentives, and you also have some state tax incentives in each state. And again, I have in one part of the book, I have a section called Investor Motivation, which are a list of about 12 reasons why people invest in films. Tax, treatment might be one of those investment motivations. So you can look at that. I mean, don't overlook it, don't ignore it, but don't over promote it either.
Excellent. Thank you so much for going through some of the chapters in the book and giving the information that you have. But What is the exact motivation for you to have written this book?
Well, I'm coming to the end of my career. I'm kind of semi-retired. I'm still working when people call and want me to do an offering, but so I'm just kind of put it all in this book. Here it is. And
Excellent.
laid it out. This is my 30 years of experience and study of film industry and film finance, and it's in a very narrow area. Investor financing. I've never claimed that investor financing is the best way to finance a feature film. I've just said that for some film projects, it may be the only way the producer can get their vision on the screen. And, like with Justin Lin, that worked out really great for him. Mm-hmm. And I've had a few others that, like I had a guy who did the story of Mother Teresa, the life story of Mother Teresa, which was a beautiful film. He premiered it at the Directors Guild there in Los Angeles. And that was a good experience. He really did a good job on that film.
And the book. For domestic and international audiences, where's the best place to purchase the book? And I'll put all the information in the show notes for everyone listening.
Well, I mean, the publisher is Focal Press, which is, I think, a subsidiary of Taylor, Routledge and Taylor and Francis. So they're big publishers, and I think they're based in England, as I recall. But I've got a book flyer that I'm sending out to people. I sent one to you, mm-hmm. and that the publisher prepared, and it offers a little discount on the book. So if someone wanted to get that discount and order the book directly from the publisher as opposed to going through a bookstore, which they may be available in bookstores. I just have no idea. And you can certainly order it through a bookstore. But if you send me an email address, I'll send you the flyer and you can order direct through the publisher.
Excellent. So in the show notes, I'll put the flyer. I'll put the details to contact John and his website, and you can go and read the book because I'm sure you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah, if you've got the flyer and can put it up and it shows that second page where it has the publisher's discount, then that'll take care of it. They can order it that way.
John, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope to speak to you soon.
All right, good. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have you thought of upgrading your cinematography game? Would you like to have an ASC cinematographer mentor you for free? Join veteran cinematographer Suki Medenzovic, ASC, Disney, Pixar, FX Networks, Netflix, American Horror Story. As he teaches you how to create beautiful images using 3 lighting techniques he has mastered on film sets over his 30-plus years in the film industry. Each technique uses basic, low-cost lighting equipment so that anyone can achieve beautiful visuals no matter your project's budget. If you want to take your cinematography to the next level, visit filmmakingconversations.com to sign up for instant access. If you like this podcast, share it with friends, leave a comment in the comments section, and hit the subscribe button.